I didn't say a word when they handed me that eviction notice. Just slid the 1918 water rights deed across the mahogany table and watched the smug little smirk fade from the Clearwater Hollow HOA lawyer's face. "Mr. Keller," he began, clearing his throat. "We're just, trying to resolve this civilly." But I'd already stood up. Tucked the old, yellow document back into its protective leather folder. Looked him square in the eye. "You built your paradise on the wrong damn side of the river. They thought they could take my family's land while I was building flood infrastructure in Iraq. My grandfather's ranch, 47 acres of pristine valley land just outside Pine Hills, Colorado, wasn't just a patch of dirt. It was legacy. It was water. And water out here, well, it's everything. Grandpa Graham bought the land in 1952, before the ski resorts, before the housing booms, back when the Black Bear River was still considered seasonal. In 1978, with help from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he built a small earth dam. Nothing fancy, just clean, practical engineering. It fed the cattle during droughts, buffered our downstream neighbors during floods, and kept the land fertile. He used to say, "This valley won't make you rich, Evan. But it'll keep your soul honest." That dam and the water it collected were the heart of Clearwater Hollow long before it had a name. But while I was deployed, something changed. HOA changed. They call themselves Clearwater Hollow Association now, used to be a handful of retirees organizing snow removal. Somewhere along the way, it became a private government with power to fine, seize, and even evict. And Betsy Randall? She became their queen. President of the HOA, wife of local commissioner Thomas Randall, and self-declared protector of community aesthetics. If pastel shutters and ornamental rocks were sacred, she was the high priestess. If you didn't comply, she'd fine you, shame you, or rezone you into oblivion. The moment I returned from my third tour, I noticed the difference. My access road had been renamed Private Entry. Fencing with HOA signs stretched across the lower pasture. I drove past new model homes with fake log siding and American flags stuck into perfectly manicured mulch. But nothing prepared me for what I saw on the back 40. Survey stakes. Excavators. A sign that read, "Future site of Black Bear Chalets, luxury riverfront living." On my goddamn land. They'd paved a service road directly over the natural creek, diverted the Black Bear River's flow, and drained Grandpa's reservoir by nearly 4 feet. And that's when I walked into the HOA office in my uniform. They were drinking artisan coffee, talking about dog leash lengths and snowplow contracts. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just pulled out the 1918 deed. Signed by my great-grandfather. Filed in the state archives. And I let the silence do the talking. The deed grants senior water rights to the Black Bear River, rights that predate the HOA, the town, and even the State Water Management Board. And with Grandpa's dam built under federal guidance, it wasn't just water. It was federal jurisdiction. The HOA lawyer's hand trembled as he handed me the eviction notice anyway. And in that moment, I knew 2 things. 1, they were scared. 2, this wasn't just a property fight. This was war. Betsy Randall drove her golf cart like she owned the road, which, in her mind, she probably did. The first time I saw her in person, she was wearing a pastel pink pantsuit and a sun visor big enough to shade a driveway. She parked sideways across the gravel outside my farmhouse and stepped out like she was inspecting livestock. "Mr. Keller," she called, all syrup and steel. "This really is all a misunderstanding." Behind her sat 3 HOA board members, matching polos, clipboards in hand, trying to look important while they squinted into the midday sun. One of them actually had a measuring tape clipped to his belt. I had the sudden, irrational urge to snap it in half. Betsy smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "This land's been underutilized for years. The community deserves to grow." I looked past her at the construction site encroaching on my lower pasture. Dust clouds rose behind concrete mixers. The stench of diesel and wet clay turned my stomach. You rerouted the Black Bear, I said. She waved it off. We installed an environmentally approved diversion channel. It's perfectly safe. That reservoir's dropped 4 feet since June. She ignored the accusation, her tone sweetening unnaturally. We're offering a generous buyout, Evan. I've personally spoken with your sister. She's overwhelmed. Wouldn't it be best for everyone if we handled this amicably? I stared at her. You're trespassing. One of the polo-clad goons stepped forward, clipboard raised. Actually, the HOA filed for constructive possession under the Quiet Land Use Act. Save the legalese, I snapped. I'm not your average retiree with a garden gnome violation. You're trying to steal federal flood infrastructure. That dam was built with Corps oversight. Beth's side twitched. I'd hit the nerve. They weren't used to pushback. Most of the residents in Clearwater Hollow were retirees, telecommuters, or overwhelmed first-time buyers. People who couldn't afford to fight. People who gave up. But I wasn't people. I was a hydrologist who spent 2 tours restoring irrigation in Kandahar. I once rebuilt a levee while under sniper fire. HOA subcommittees didn't scare me. Still, I needed leverage. So I went hunting. Down at the Pine Hills County Records office, I dug through dusty boxes stacked under buzzing fluorescent lights. I found Grandpa's dam construction permits, stamped in 1978 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Federal oversight. Flood control purpose. Jurisdiction language that made my heart race. And then, like divine intervention, I stumbled across the real gem, a 1918 senior water rights deed signed by my great-grandfather, Arthur Keller, giving us priority use of Black Bear River for agricultural irrigation, in perpetuity, the deed said. They weren't just diverting water. They were committing environmental theft. Over the next week, I called in favors. My old Army buddy Julian Watts, now working with the EPA Enforcement Division, confirmed my suspicions. If they're diverting a natural watercourse without federal clearance, he said, that's a Clean Water Act violation. Big one. I began installing trail cameras. Documenting flow patterns. Collecting samples. And while I built my case, Bethsy went on the offensive. She posted on the community forum claiming I was aggressive, possibly unstable, and threatening the neighborhood. She never used my name, but everyone knew who she meant. Soon enough, I had HOA safety patrols parked at my gate. They took photos of visitors. Logged license plates. Left flyers about unsightly structures on my barn, the same barn that's been here since 1963. Then came the inspections. Health Department. Building Code. Animal Control. All within 48 hours. Each found minor, fixable issues but issued warnings anyway. It was a bureaucratic blitzkrieg. And it pissed me off. Because I knew this playbook. I'd seen it used in war zones to destabilize villages. Create enough pressure, confusion, and fear, people fold. But they underestimated just how stubborn a combat engineer can be. Especially one with nothing left to lose. Because this wasn't about profit. It wasn't even about land. It was about the water. And I'd be damned if I let them kill Grandpa's river just to water their goddamn ornamental ferns. The county planning office smelled like mildew and coffee grounds, and the woman behind the plexiglass had the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many angry residents and not enough raises. Section 42B, parcel September 11th, 17, I said, sliding the paper forward. She raised an eyebrow. You're the guy with the dam. I nodded. Apparently. She typed slowly, like each keystroke hurt. You know the HOA filed an adverse possession claim? I do now. She squinted at the screen, then gave a low whistle. They fast-tracked a zoning change too. Agricultural to residential mixed use. Approved by Commissioner Randall. Oh. That's her husband, isn't it? I just smiled tightly. Typical Pine Hills, she muttered, hitting print. Here's the zoning docket, signatures, And permit history. Good luck. You'll need it. I walked out with a manila folder thick enough to choke a goat. Back at the farmhouse, I spread the documents across Grandpa's old kitchen table. Dates, stamps, hand-scribbled amendments, it was a bureaucratic spiderweb. But I'd spent years reverse engineering Taliban water theft operations. I could handle suburban corruption. I highlighted inconsistencies. Caught permit overlaps. Noticed that the site survey used in the development application was signed by a firm that didn't exist in state licensing records. Fake engineers. Classic. And the floodplain maps? Doctored. According to the Army Corps' own flood hazard zones, the new development was smack in the middle of a 100-year flood basin. But Clearwater Hollow's submitted plan claimed no historical flood risk. Which was laughable. I'd seen that land flood 3 times before I turned 18. They lied to the insurance companies, the county, and the banks. And I had the maps to prove it. I called Julian. This isn't just a zoning dispute, I said. It's federal insurance fraud. He whistled. Send everything you've got. If you're right, they're toast. I scanned the whole file, uploaded it to a secure drive, and waited. Meanwhile, Bethsy escalated her campaign. She convinced the Pine Hills Gazette to run a hit piece. Disturbed veteran threatens community water safety, the headline read. There was a grainy photo of me working on the dam, taken without my knowledge, making me look like a terrorist preparing for sabotage. I laughed. Then I got angry. Then I started preparing. I updated the hydraulic gates, modernized the actuators, ran diagnostics on the spillway controls, and reinforced the emergency diversion channels. I also began logging every drop of diverted water using flow meters I installed at 3 key points: the original creek, the new HOA channel, and my reservoir outlet. Every gallon they stole was now data. I even pulled samples for a local university environmental lab. Within days, they reported sediment contamination levels consistent with concrete runoff, straight from the Black Bear Chalet's construction site. EPA violation number 2. But the real tipping point came when I visited Mrs. Natsuko Nakano. Her backyard once hosted a terraced vegetable garden fed by a branch of the black bear. Her late husband, a World War II vet, had designed a small gravity-fed irrigation system using creek water. Now her tomatoes were dead. Been growing here since 1964, she said quietly, kneeling beside brittle stalks. First year nothing lived. I showed her the documents. The floodplain maps. The lies. Her lips pressed into a firm line. What do you need? A witness, I said. One with history. She nodded. So did Raul Mendoza, whose family's hay farm lost 40% of its yield since the diversion. And the Sandovals, whose well had run dry for the first time in 30 years. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Bethsy thought she could drown me in red tape. But I was about to drown her in evidence. The black bear didn't roar. It whispered. But if you knew how to listen, the sound of moving water could tell you everything: flow rate, sediment drag, and more importantly, who'd been messing with it. I sat under the footbridge near the old oak tree Grandpa planted in '61, watching as the diverted creek trickled weakly toward the back end of the HOA development. Just enough to keep their decorative pond filled. Just enough to make it look natural. They thought no one would notice. They didn't count on me noticing everything. My flow meters told the story better than any lawyer could: 1,160 gallons per day redirected. That's over 400,000 gallons annually, stolen from my family's dam, our downstream neighbors, and every piece of life that had relied on the black bear for generations. Raul Mendoza walked up beside me, dusty from working his field. You ever think about just blowing it all up? He asked, not entirely joking. I chuckled. Nah. Too messy. I've got something better. That something was already in motion. I'd met with Kayla Bryn, a pro bono environmental lawyer who had once gone toe-to-toe with Chevron in a river rights case and walked away with a settlement that made national news. She looked at my documentation like it was Christmas morning. "This isn't just a Clean Water Act case," she said. "This is federal jurisdiction. Fraud. Possibly even racketeering if we find a pattern." "There's a pattern," I said. "And it starts with Bethsy." Kayla dug into the HOA's history and found something stunning. Clearwater Hollow wasn't the first. Bethsy Randall had been president of 2 previous HOAs in Colorado, one of which had quietly settled a $1.4 million EPA case for a near-identical water diversion. She'd walked away clean. Started over here. And no one connected the dots. Until now. We prepared a multi-agency filing, EPA, State Water Commission, FEMA flood zone violations, and even the State Attorney General's Office for Insurance Misrepresentation. Meanwhile, Julian confirmed that EPA enforcement agents had flagged my case for immediate review. "This is the kind of thing that gets investigators out of their chairs," he said. "I've got a regional director on standby. If you can show the dam's original function, we're golden." So I did what any military hydrologist would do. I opened the old service hatch and crawled into the spillway chamber. 47 years of cobwebs and rust couldn't hide the genius of Grandpa Graham's engineering. The gate mechanisms still moved, albeit stiffly, and the diversion sluice had barely any structural damage. I cleaned it. Lubed the gears. Rebuilt the control handle. Then I ran a test, a slow trickle down the original path of the Black Bear. The water followed its old channel like it had been waiting. I stood there, soaked to the knees, grinning like a madman. That afternoon, I emailed drone footage, flow data, and historical documentation to the EPA and Kayla. Everything we needed to show the creek's natural path, the dam's purpose, and the downstream damage caused by its diversion. Bethsy, meanwhile, escalated again. She held an emergency HOA meeting in front of the model homes, complete with a local news crew. Children with juice boxes posed next to protect our neighborhood signs while she made an emotional speech about dangerous dam structures threatening family safety. "They say he's a veteran," she told the camera, voice trembling. "But he's acting like a saboteur." The soundbite made the evening news. But the same broadcast included a statement from the EPA acknowledging an ongoing investigation, and footage of me standing by the dam, calmly explaining the water flow system to their regional agent. The contrast was devastating. HOA theatrics versus federal science. By now, the HOA board was panicking. They offered me a settlement, $250,000 for the lower pasture and full release of any water claims. I didn't even blink. "You don't understand," I told Bethsy over the phone. "It's not for sale. It never was." "But you'll lose everything," she snapped. "No," I said. "You will." The skies were shifting. Storm clouds curled over the ridge like a warning from the old gods, and the wind carried that electric scent of rain on dry stone. The timing couldn't have been better. Or worse, depending on which side of the dam you stood. I stood alone at the spillway control lever that morning, a thermos of coffee in one hand, Grandpa's worn field journal in the other. In '83, he'd recorded the last time he opened the gates for a spring flood relief. "Flowed smooth," he'd scribbled. "Nakano's garden greened up in 48 hours. I was about to do it again, but for very different reasons. The EPA agents were scheduled to arrive in 2 days. But the forecast said the rain would come tonight. That gave me a window, short, dangerous, and perfect. I checked the gauges. The dam was holding steady at 3.1 million gallons. I'd calculated that 2.7 million was the maximum flow needed to replicate a natural floodplain restoration without threatening any structures downstream, assuming, of course, that no one had built in the creek's historical path. They had, of course. 5 homes in the premium riverfront tier sat directly over what used to be the Black Bear's seasonal overflow channel. Decorative gravel now covered the very soil that used to absorb the spring runoff. which meant this wasn't just a demonstration anymore. It was exposure. Kayla warned me. If anything floods, they'll spin it as terrorism. Be careful. I nodded. I will. That's why I'm documenting everything. I had drone footage, time-lapse cameras, historical maps, affidavits from Raul and Mrs. Nakano, EPA correspondence, sediment studies, and now, rain on the way. That night, I stood in the rain, listening to the steady trickle of runoff hit the dam's surface. The wind tugged at my jacket. My fingers hovered over the release mechanism. Then headlights. 2 trucks pulled up outside the fence. Private security again, the same crew Bethsy hired to patrol suspicious properties. They stepped out in tactical gear like they were guarding a Pentagon annex. One of them held a camcorder. The other held a crowbar. I hit record on my phone and walked straight toward the gate. You're trespassing on federally registered infrastructure, I said calmly. You're operating a dangerous, unlicensed dam, the bigger one replied, stepping forward. We're here to ensure safety. I raised an eyebrow. With bolt cutters? He hesitated. Then Kayla pulled in behind them, high beams blazing. You're on camera and committing a felony, she called from her car. Interfering with federal flood control structures is a criminal offense. I suggest you leave before the sheriff arrives. They bolted. We filed the report with the sheriff and forwarded the footage to Julian at the EPA. His reply was simple, you're locked in now. Don't flinch. The next morning, I did what Grandpa would have done. I opened the gates, carefully, by degrees, allowing a controlled release of 20% flow. The creek drank it in like it had been thirsty for decades. The curve of water followed its ancient path, trickling around willow roots and between stones that hadn't seen water in years. Mrs. Nakano called me, her voice shaking. It's back, she whispered. The water's back. Raul texted, hayfield soaked. It's working. For the first time in months, I smiled. Then came the sirens. A Pine Hills fire engine pulled up, lights flashing, with none other than Commissioner Thomas Randall stepping out behind it in a slick rain jacket and scowl. He waved a sheaf of paper. Cease and desist, he shouted over the rising wind. Emergency order to suspend all dam operations. Kayla stood beside me, clipboard in hand. Not valid, she said. You don't have jurisdiction. Thomas fumed. You're endangering homes. Kayla held up the original 1978 Army Corps permit and the Agricultural Flood Covenant. Actually, the law requires him to maintain seasonal flow. This is the safe option. And just as Thomas opened his mouth to object, the local news van arrived, camera rolling, mic hot. The optics were brutal. City commissioner shouting about danger, standing in front of a restored creek surrounded by blooming wildflowers and grateful neighbors. That night, Channel 7 ran a split-screen report. On one side, Thomas Randall screaming about imminent disaster. On the other, drone footage of kids playing by a babbling stream. Guess which image stuck? They couldn't stop me with court orders. They couldn't stop me with propaganda. So they tried sabotage. It started small. One morning I found the dam gate lever jammed with a twisted piece of rebar. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, just enough to seize the gear, not enough to break it permanently. I freed it with some WD-40 and elbow grease, but I knew it was a warning shot. Next came the drone. Not mine. It buzzed overhead at 2 a.m., circling like a fly with a GoPro. I tracked its flight path and traced it back to the HOA clubhouse roof. I reported it to the sheriff, unauthorized surveillance, but no charges stuck. Sheriff McGill just sighed and said, "You know how this town works, Evan." Yeah. I did. Which is why I'd already set up motion-triggered cameras around the dam and farmhouse. And that's how I caught them. 2 nights later, 3:47 a.m. 3 men in black rain gear crossed the fence near the spillway. One carried a bucket. The other 2 had crowbars and a flashlight. I watched them on my phone from the kitchen, rage simmering. They were pouring something, fast-setting concrete, into the emergency overflow channel. I called Kayla. "You need to call 911, she said, voice deadly calm. "Then document everything." By the time Deputy Wallace arrived, the crew was gone, but the damage was fresh. Hardened concrete had partially blocked the overflow valve, and the stench of wet cement still hung in the air. I handed him the footage. He whistled. "That's enough to put someone in cuffs." Except no one was arrested. By morning, HOA board member Mark Lanning had already given a statement to the local paper, "Unstable property owner fabricating sabotage to cover unauthorized flood risks." The article made me sound like a lunatic with a bunker full of damn manuals. But behind the scenes, the tide was turning. Julian at the EPA sent word they were sending a federal response team. The combination of water rights abuse, environmental violations, and now criminal sabotage had tripped the threshold. They'd arrive within 72 hours. Meanwhile, Kayla filed an emergency injunction to prevent further interference with the dam. But Bethsy wasn't done. That afternoon, 2 child protection agents showed up at my door. "We received a community concern," the woman said politely, alleging that an unstable veteran might be posing a safety risk to visiting minors. There were no minors. No visitors. Just me, my dogs, and a stack of flow reports. It was coordinated character assassination. A smear campaign of weaponized bureaucracy. She wanted to bury me in paperwork until I collapsed. Instead, I kept digging. Kayla's in turn unearthed something critical. Clearwater Hollow's development plan included an environmental impact report, signed and notarized, that falsely claimed no waterway modification. But we had satellite images showing otherwise. Construction photos. Flow data. Expert affidavits. Insurance fraud. Banking fraud. Federal deception. And then came the weather. Storm clouds brewed over the Rockies, and NOAA issued a 3-day rainfall warning for Pine Hills County. That meant flood risk, real flood risk, and with the overflow channel still half-blocked, the HOA homes downstream were about to learn why you don't mess with hydrology. I called the volunteer fire department myself. "If that overflow valve stays blocked," I warned, "you're looking at residential basement flooding." They took me seriously. Chief Alvarez deployed a pump crew to my dam and officially recorded a public safety alert. That night, Mrs. Nakano called me again. "The cherry blossoms bloomed," she said softly. "For the first time in 3 years." I walked to the spillway, flashlight in hand, and saw it for myself, the old creek, winding through its ancient path, alive again. But as I turned back, I saw it. A new sign posted at the edge of the development. HOA safety notice, unstable flood structure ahead. Proceed at own risk. Right next to my property. With my name scratched onto it in black marker. The sign was more than a warning, it was a threat, dressed up as concern. It stood at the property line like a scarlet letter nailed to my land, trying to scare off sympathy. But the only thing it scared was my patience. By the next morning, the rain started, a steady, soaking curtain draped over Pine Hills. My gauges showed rising water at the dam and increasing saturation downstream. Everything was going according to nature's plan. Except for the fact that 5 luxury homes were sitting right where the Black Bear River used to breathe. I walked the creek in the rain, checking each of my flow meters. The water was climbing, but the dam was holding beautifully. Grandpa's system, even half a century old, was doing its job. If only the same could be said about our local government. Julian called. "The EPA team's been moved up," he said. "Weather risk plus sabotage? They'll be there tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. sharp." Kayla and I regrouped. She was already working with regional press, pushing the real story. The dam wasn't a danger, it was a lifeline. The HOA's interference had created the hazard. And I was the guy keeping their homes dry. We made a plan. At 6 a.m., I would open the gates to 40% capacity, enough to restore seasonal flow and test the limits of the natural creek. It wasn't flooding. It was documentation. Evidence. Real-time proof of how the watershed should function. And we'd do it all under EPA supervision. That night, Kayla stayed at the farmhouse, poring over documents while the rain drummed on the roof. I slept in Grandpa's old recliner, boots on, phone in hand, ready for anything. At 3:12 a.m., it came. Motion alert. South spillway camera. I tapped the feed and swore. 2 figures. Dark clothing. One with a shovel. The other with a bucket. Concrete. Again. I grabbed my raincoat and rushed out with a flashlight and my phone camera already recording. By the time I reached the dam, they were halfway through filling the emergency outlet with mix. But I wasn't alone. Chief Alvarez stood by the tree line with 2 volunteers and a floodlight. "Hands where we can see 'em," he barked. "You're interfering with public infrastructure." The 2 men froze. It wasn't HOA volunteers this time. These guys were contractors, the kind that work without permits and don't ask questions. They were arrested on the spot. Their tools seized. The bucket, still half full of wet concrete, was logged into evidence. And best of all, their phones were confiscated, too. Later that morning, Julian called with the cherry on top. "Evan," he said, "we got phone records. HOA board group texts. Explicit instructions to neutralize the flood risk by any means necessary. You're about to be a hero." At 7:58 a.m., I stood at the spillway with Kayla, Chief Alvarez, and 2 EPA agents in windbreakers, clipboards in hand. At exactly 8 o'clock, I opened the gates to 40%. The water surged forward, controlled, graceful, like a vein clearing after years of blockage. The creek filled its natural bed with a clean rush, soaking Raul's pasture, feeding the Cano's terraces, and curving around the back of the development like it always had. No basements flooded. No homes were damaged. The flood line stopped exactly where the old Army Corps map said it would, 2 feet short of Betsy's prized concrete koi pond. EPA Agent Harris turned to me and smiled. "Perfectly engineered," he said. "Textbook restoration." Kayla was already handing out press packets. The local news drone buzzed overhead, capturing the rebirth of the Black Bear River. And across the development, I saw Betsy watching from behind her tinted BMW windows, white-knuckling the steering wheel, mascara bleeding down her cheekbones. Because she knew. She'd crossed the flood line. And I'd just drawn it back. The beauty of water is that it doesn't lie. It flows where it wants, remembers where it's been, and always finds a way home. That's what happened on the morning the EPA finished their inspection. The Black Bear River returned to its original course like a ghost reclaiming its bones, not violently, not with vengeance, but with certainty. Like it had never left. But for Clearwater Hollow, that certainty hit like a wrecking ball. The EPA agents spent the morning walking the creek with me, drone footage in hand, confirming measurements. Kayla provided full documentation, historical maps, core engineering specs, pre-development satellite photos, and sworn affidavits from half a dozen neighbors. Agent Harris looked up from his clipboard and said, "Mr. Keller, I don't think you understand how rare it is to see a case this clean." I shrugged. Clean water, clean paper trail. They nodded in quiet appreciation, the kind bureaucrats reserve for undeniable truth. By noon, the first wave hit, a cease and desist order issued by the EPA to Clearwater Hollow HOA, suspending all development activity and prohibiting any further modification to the Black Bear watershed. By 3 p.m., the second wave came crashing down. The Colorado Department of Insurance froze the development's coverage policies pending a fraud investigation. And then, at 4:41 p.m., the banks blinked. Pine Hills Regional Bank, the primary financier behind the Black Bear Chalets development, issued a notice of default. The $11.6 million loan package they'd extended, based on flood mitigation guarantees and falsified impact reports, was now classified as unsecured. Betsy's face when the sheriff taped that foreclosure notice to the HOA clubhouse door. I'll see it in my dreams forever. But it wasn't over yet. Kayla and I had planned a community meeting for that evening. Raul helped set up the old barn with hay bales and string lights. Mrs. Nakano brought rice crackers and green tea. Even Chief Alvarez showed up with his off-duty crew, volunteers, neighbors, reporters. Nearly 100 people packed into that barn. I stood up front, flanked by Kayla and EPA Agent Harris, and held up Grandpa's old field journal. I'm not here to take a victory lap, I said. I'm here to thank every one of you who didn't look the other way when the river went missing. Applause. Real, honest applause. Then Kayla took the mic. She laid it all out, the fraud, the sabotage, the harassment campaign, the banking violations, and the legal precedent we were setting. She announced the formation of the Clearwater Watershed Trust, a non-profit coalition to protect the entire river corridor from future development abuse. And just when the energy in the room reached its peak, Julian Watts walked in. Straight from D.C., wearing his EPA badge like a sheriff's star. He stepped up beside me and said, "The Department of Justice is preparing to open a federal RICO investigation into Clearwater Hollow HOA and its officers." The barn exploded with gasps, applause, and even a few tears. I looked over at Mrs. Nakano, who simply bowed her head in quiet relief. Later that night, Kayla and I stood by the creek, lanterns glowing in the dark. "You did it," she said. "No," I replied. "We did it." She nudged me with her elbow. "You know this isn't over, right?" I nodded. "Good. I'm just getting started." You'd think when a corrupt HOA collapses under the weight of its own lies, the people behind it would disappear. But snakes don't vanish. They just slither somewhere darker. Betsy Randall didn't attend the next board meeting, because there was no board meeting. The HOA charter had been suspended pending legal review, and her resignation hit the community website like a thunderclap. No apology. No explanation. Just a cold, corporate effective immediately. But the fallout didn't stop with her. HOA Treasurer Mark Lanning was arrested for falsifying financial records. Investigators uncovered slush fund payments, cash kickbacks from contractors, and evidence that monthly dues were being funneled into private accounts. Vice President Shirley Knowles, charged with obstruction after instructing HOA employees to delete internal emails once the EPA got involved. The HOA itself, the institution, was declared non-operational by the county court. Clearwater Hollow became what it had feared most, self-governed. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. But not everyone celebrated. A small but vocal group of homeowners, mostly newcomers who had never seen the original creek, circulated flyers calling me a dangerous radical who'd tanked property values and unilaterally weaponized a water feature. They didn't care about history, or nature, or truth. They cared about resale value. "You should sue for defamation," Kayla said one afternoon as we walked along the restored bank. "Nah," I said. "Let him scream. I've got the river on my side." We reached the bend near Mrs. Nakano's garden, now blooming again with snap peas and wild herbs. She waved from her porch and held up a teacup in salute. That meant more than any lawsuit. Meanwhile, the EPA issued a final report praising the private conservation efforts undertaken by Mr. Keller and the Clearwater Trust. It made the rounds in environmental circles, even earned a short feature on public radio. But the most unexpected moment came from Julian. He showed up again, in full EPA field gear, and handed me a sealed letter. "What's this?" I asked. "A nomination," he said. "You're being considered for a state-level environmental stewardship award." I laughed so hard I nearly fell into the creek. "I didn't do this for a plaque." Julian clapped me on the shoulder. "That's why you deserve it." And then, the lawsuit landed. Filed by Betsy herself. She was suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and, wait for it, interference with her business interests. Kayla read the document out loud, almost choking on her coffee. She's claiming you deliberately caused irreparable reputational harm by impersonating a hydrology expert. I stared at her. I am a hydrology expert. She didn't bother checking your resume. So we filed a counterclaim, citing harassment, libel, and damages incurred during her organized sabotage campaign. By the time it reached court, the judge took one look at the footage of her contractors pouring concrete into a flood channel and tossed her case out like wet garbage. In his closing remarks, the judge said, "It is the court's opinion that Ms. Randall's actions were not only unlawful but actively dangerous. Mr. Keller's conduct, by contrast, preserved both private and public safety." Case dismissed. The courtroom burst into scattered applause. Kayla just smiled. Next time she files a lawsuit, it'll be from a payphone. Spring came early to Pine Hills that year. The snowmelt ran heavy through the Rockies, and the Black Bear flowed strong, clean, and full of life. Everything the HOA tried to bury had come back, stronger, deeper, inevitable. Like water always does. The Clearwater Watershed Trust, now an official nonprofit, received its first major grant in March. We used it to purchase a 12-acre stretch of wetland upstream, once slated for development. It would now become a protected nature corridor, with walking trails, signs, and a plaque honoring my grandfather's dam. The kids in town called it Keller Creek. Even the local high school science class ran field trips there. But it wasn't about legacy. It was about the land. About listening to it. The EPA's final restoration report listed the Black Bear as a rehabilitated natural watercourse with full seasonal health indicators. They gave it a Grade A status, the first time a previously diverted river in the county had earned it in over 2 decades. Betsy, meanwhile, was gone. She quietly moved to Arizona, where rumor had it she tried joining another HOA board in Scottsdale. The internet, of course, didn't let her forget. Her name was now permanently tied to the Clearwater case. The woman who tried to kill a river and lost. Mark Lanning got 18 months of house arrest. Shirley Knowles took a plea deal and never spoke publicly again. And the Clearwater Hollow HOA? Dissolved. In its place, the community formed a simple neighborhood council, no fines, no bylaws, no boards. Just people talking to people. Imagine that. I rebuilt the dam walkway with Raul and his sons. Mrs. Nakano donated wind chimes she made herself. Chief Alvarez stopped by often, mostly just to sit and watch the current. As for me, I kept working the land. Fixing up Grandpa's place. Logging creek data. Planting trees where the soil welcomed roots again. Sometimes, I just sat near the water and listened, the low gurgle of it carving through rock like it always had, like it always would. One afternoon, Kayla joined me on the bank, a legal pad in her lap, bare feet in the stream. "You know," she said, "you could have walked away. Sold the land. Taken the buyout. Moved to Florida." I shook my head. "You don't walk away from your blood. Or from something that's older than any rule book." She smiled. "You think the river forgave us?" "No," I said, watching it curl around a boulder like an arm returning home. "I think it just remembered who we were. And in the end, that was enough."